Watercolours are great to use but can be really tricky to handle with, so here's a step-by-step, easy tutorial to get you familiar with wet on wet and wet on dry techniques. I'll be showing some tips along the way and also showing you the errors that I made as well and how you can avoid those. So to start, you will need a watercolour set and paint palette. Tubes or pans are fine. I'm using my Winsor & Newton set, which comes with 2 palettes. 2 pots or jars of water, one for cleaning your brush and one for mixing paint. This way you'll have one jar that stays clean so your colours don't go too muddy. I'm using cold pressed watercolour paper, but thicker paper like cartridge paper or card will be fine as well for this piece. Get some scrap paper as well for colour swatches and tests. These are the brushes I'm using: a pointed round brush, a flat brush and an old decorating brush. It's fine to use the one that you have already, but I'll show you why I chose these ones later. I like to use a cloth to soak up excess water from the brush, but you'll also need paper towels as well if you want to remove any excess water from the painting. The last one is optional, but you can use a mini fan or hairdryer to help speed up the drying process. If you're using pans, it's a good idea to wet the colours first with a spray bottle. This helps to just activate the colours and just make it a lot easier to work with. It's really handy to have a range of brushes in different shapes and sizes, and over time you'll kind of find the ones that you prefer to work with. So I'm using a flat brush because it's good for covering areas in a precise way. I also like turning it on its side because it's really good for painting straight lines with. The pointed round brush has more flexibility, so it's good for fluid lines, and old brushes are really good to keep just for adding textures and making different marks. So even if the brushes are like really old and battered, I tend to keep them because they do tend to come in handy. I'll demonstrate the wet on wet technique first. So where the page is wet, the colours will automatically bleed, and where the area is dry, the shape is fixed. So you can see how in the middle section here, the colours have automatically started to spread out. And the more pigment that you have on your brush, or the wetter the page, the more it will just naturally spread, whereas the less water that you have on it, the less the colours will move. And you can also add more colours into it and pull colours out as well. And the thing about wet and wet techniques is that it can produce really interesting colours and textures and tone, but it can also be really tricky to handle and be quite unpredictable as well. Moving on to tone. With watercolours, the lightness or darkness of a colour changes depending on the amount of water you add. You can practice this by picking one colour, then slowly add more and more water as you go along whilst doing swatches to compare. Because my brush is really wet, the colour pools and concentrates on the right. Also, I'm doing these on cartridge paper instead of watercolour paper, which isn't as absorbent, so you will find that you get different results depending on the type of materials that you use. Now I'm half drying this so that the left hand side is dry but the right hand side is still damp. And again you'll see how wet on dry will hold its shape, but wet on wet will bleed together. And I'm using the same colour for all these little strokes, but you will see how the strength of the colour is comparative to the colours around it. And you can layer colours on top of each other depending on how concentrated the colours are. So even though a yellow would technically be seen as lighter than a dark green, you can see how well it kind of shows on top of each other here. But depending on how strong that colour is, a tint will likely still show through. Here's the colours that I'm using for the first piece. Yours might be called differently depending on the set you're using, so just use whichever's are closest to these. For this tutorial I'm keeping the colours simple, but I will be doing future videos on colour mixing and how to pick a colour scheme, so do subscribe if you want to see those. Here's the reference photo, so it's just some fields near where I live, and I'll show you how to simplify this. So I'm painting strips with a flat brush, starting with yellow, then yellow ochre, then a mix of both with more water. Do have some scrap paper on the side to test how strong you like the colours before you use it. And always make sure to clean your brush as well in between colours. It's often better to start lighter because you can layer on top to make it go darker, and just make sure that there's a gap in between each colour so they don't bleed together. And make sure this part is completely dry before you move on to the next bit. You can always use your finger to check if it's damp or not, but make sure to not do that too early, otherwise you will leave a finger mark. I'm using the same brush, but you can use whichever you prefer, and just paint 3 lines above each of the colour section. It doesn't have to be too neat because I quite like it when the lines are a bit crooked or if there's little gaps in between. Now, taking more of the same colour but with a pointed brush instead, I'm just going to do a few dabs in a few sections just on the lines just to look like trees or foliage, and you can just be quite random with this, there's no rules really. Whilst the green is still wet, we're going to do the same thing with some yellow and some sap green as well. So you just need to dab it next to it. You don't need to blend them into each other, just make sure that they're touching, and over time the water will just automatically just do its work really. Now dilute some of the dark green in a separate section of your palette, and take the coarse brush, hold it vertically and just gently dab it in the front part of your painting. To create this texture, the brush can't be too wet, so you might want to just wipe off any excess paint on a paper towel or on a cloth, whichever you're using. Now make that colour a bit darker by adding more of the green into it, and we'll just repeat the process and dab another layer on top. Taking the pointed brush and the darkest green, we're going to just add a few strokes and some flecks and dots as well, just for details. You don't need to be neat with this, it's just to give the impression of plants. And that's about it for the first piece. Here's the finished piece next to the reference photo, and you can see how it's been simplified but still represents the photo well. I actually painted this a few months ago on cartridge paper, so it does work on thinner paper. You don't have to use watercolour paper. And for the second piece, I actually based it off the first painting and not so much the photo, so you can see how it has progressed and it has been simplified further. Moving on to the second piece, we'll explore Watercolour Techniques more by painting some wildflowers in the field. Again, I'll list my colours here, and do note that there's a lot of swatches on the bottom, so do keep mixing your colours until you're happy with them. At the time I was really happy with this colour palette, but as soon as I started painting I could just see how it wouldn't work, so do watch on to see how and why I amended these. With this one we'll start by wetting the page first, but leave a centimetre gap around the edge. Then dilute the lighter blue and apply it across the top half of the page whilst it's still wet. And it really depends on your own preference how light or dark you want the sky to be, but mine is a bit darker than how it looks on camera. Now let this layer dry completely before doing the next layer. For the next part we'll be using a pale green. Now apply some of the lighter green, and whilst it's still wet, just dab in some of the darker colour just to kind of let it bleed into it. But this is where I noticed I messed up. So this is the original that I did using a few references from Pinterest. I wanted to try slightly different colours this time, but the original ones are a lot better. And also my application was wrong, so we'll adjust that as well. So the colour on the left hand side is the original, and on the right hand side I added just a little bit of dark brown just to make the colour more earthy. And I added more of the hot green to the darker colour as well, just because the colour palette just seems a lot more balanced this way. Now we can start again. So wet the page, add blue and let it dry. So last time round I didn't dilute the green enough, so this time we're going to add more water and just casually apply it to the second half of the page. You don't need to fill up the whole area because I quite like just leaving some areas blank. And the mistake I made before as well is I thought that if I just applied the dark colour on top it will just naturally kind of blend down, but that's not really the case, so instead we're going to do it gradually. So we're going to dilute the darker green and add it in small sections whilst the pale green is still wet. I also added a tiny bit of brown to sections as well, then repeated the process with stronger green. You can always add a bit of water and work back into it just to help it blend a bit more smoothly, or just help wash out some areas. For the flowers, we're just going to do some simple shapes with red, blue and yellow, And just experiment with how intense you want it to be, or do a mixture as well. Because we kept the green really light, the colours should pop as long as the paint isn't more diluted than the green. And just vary the shapes, the size, and where you kind of scatter the flowers just to make it look a bit more natural. Now on to the last part. Just take some of the brighter green and do some really quick upward strokes for stems. You don't need to add stems to every flower just because I feel it looks a lot more interesting this way. Now just to compare, the attempt earlier wouldn't have looked so good because I wanted the flowers to pop, so the rest of the painting should be more muted. So you can see how by doing slight changes to colour scheme and also being more careful in my application and the amount of water that I was adding to it, it really does make a huge difference. And here's the two finished pieces. Let me know which one you found more useful, and do like and subscribe for more tutorials and tips in the future. I'll see you next time.